How the Russian fleet got their ass kicked. The 18,000-mile voyage to total annihilation. On May 27, 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet met the Japanese Navy in the Tsushima Strait after sailing 18,000 miles over 7 months. The battle lasted less than 2 days. Of Russia's 38 ships, 21 were sunk, 7 captured, and 6 interned. Over 5,000 Russian sailors died. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats. It was the most one-sided naval ass-kicking in modern history, and it never should have happened at all. This is not a story of heroic sacrifice or glorious combat. This is a story of incompetence so profound, bureaucratic dysfunction so complete, and strategic thinking so divorced from reality that it resulted in an entire fleet sailing to the other side of the world only to be annihilated in a battle that everyone, including the Russian sailors themselves, knew was unwinnable. This is the story of the 2nd Pacific Squadron's voyage of the damned and the Battle of Tsushima, the naval disaster that helped spark a revolution and demonstrated that sometimes the most catastrophic defeats come not from enemy brilliance, but from your own side's spectacular failure. The disaster that started it, all to understand why the Baltic Fleet sailed to its doom, we must start with another disaster, Port Arthur. In 1904, war broke out between Russia and Japan over control of Manchuria and Korea. Russia, a vast European empire, viewed Japan as an upstart Asian power that could be easily defeated. The Russians were catastrophically wrong. On February 8, 1904, Japan launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet anchored at Port Arthur on the southern tip of Manchuria's Liaodong Peninsula. The attack severely damaged several Russian battleships and gave Japan immediate naval superiority. What followed was a siege. The Japanese army surrounded Port Arthur by land, while the Japanese Navy blockaded it by sea. The trapped Russian Pacific Fleet was being slowly destroyed by Japanese artillery firing from the surrounding hills. Russia needed to break the siege, but the Pacific Fleet was too damaged to do so alone. The solution seemed obvious. Send reinforcements. The Russian Baltic Fleet, stationed thousands of miles away in the Baltic Sea, would sail to the Pacific, crush the Japanese Navy, relieve Port Arthur, and turn the tide of the war. It was a terrible plan, but Russia was committed. The Fleet of the Damned, the 2nd Pacific Squadron, as it was officially designated, assembled in October 1904 under the command of Admiral Rozhestvensky. It consisted of 8 battleships, several quite old, 9 cruisers, 9 destroyers, multiple support vessels. The ships were not in good condition. Many were obsolete. The crews were a mix of inexperienced conscripts and sailors pulled from shore duties who hadn't been to sea in years. There had been no time for proper training. Russia needed the fleet in the Pacific immediately. Rozhestvensky himself knew the mission was nearly impossible. In a letter to his wife, he wrote that he was being sent to the other side of the world to be destroyed. But orders were orders, and on October 15, 1904, the fleet departed from Reval, modern-day Tallinn, Estonia, and began one of the most disastrous voyages in naval history. The trouble started almost immediately, the Dogger Bank incident, when Russia almost started World War I on the night of October 21st to 22nd, 1904, just 1 week into the voyage. The Russian fleet was passing through the North Sea near Dogger Bank, a fishing ground about 60 miles off the coast of England. Russian officers, paranoid about Japanese torpedo boats, which couldn't possibly be operating in the North Sea, thousands of miles from Japan, were on high alert. Sailors reported seeing suspicious vessels in the darkness. Then, someone opened fire. The Russian fleet began shooting at British fishing trawlers, convinced they were Japanese torpedo boats in disguise. For 20 minutes, Russian warships fired hundreds of shells at unarmed British fishing boats. One trawler was sunk. 2 fishermen were killed. Several others were wounded. The incident nearly caused a war between Russia and Britain. Britain's Royal Navy mobilized, and for several tense days it seemed Russia might find itself fighting a two-front war. Only intense diplomatic negotiations prevented catastrophe. The Dogger Bank incident revealed 3 critical problems with the 2nd Pacific Squadron. The officers and crew were so inexperienced they couldn't distinguish fishing boats from warships. Discipline was poor enough that multiple ships opened fire without clear identification of targets. The paranoia and stress of the mission were already taking a psychological toll, and they had only been at sea for 1 week. They had 7 more months to go. The voyage of suffering. What followed was perhaps the most miserable naval voyage ever undertaken. The route. Since the Suez Canal was controlled by Britain, now hostile after Dogger Bank, the Russian fleet had to sail around Africa. The journey covered approximately 18,000 miles, roughly 3/4 of the circumference of the Earth. The coaling problem. Coal-powered warships had limited range and needed frequent refueling. But after Dogger Bank, European nations refused the Russians access to most ports. The fleet had to coal at sea from accompanying colliers, a difficult, dangerous, and exhausting process that had to be repeated dozens of times. Coaling meant hauling hundreds of tons of coal by hand from supply ships to the warship's bunkers. The work was backbreaking, taking days each time, covering everything and everyone in coal dust. Sailors worked in heat that sometimes exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, breathing coal dust and knowing that every ton they loaded brought them closer to a battle they would probably lose. The heat. As the fleet sailed south past Africa and into tropical waters, conditions became unbearable. Russian warships were designed for Baltic waters, not tropical heat. Below decks, temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sailors collapsed from heat stroke. Food spoiled rapidly. Disease spread. The breakdowns. Ships constantly suffered mechanical failures. Engines broke down. Steering systems failed. The older vessels struggled to maintain speed, forcing the entire fleet to crawl along at the pace of the slowest ship. The morale crisis. Sailors knew they were sailing to their deaths. News from the war was universally bad. Port Arthur, which they were sailing to relieve, fell to the Japanese on January 2nd, 1905. While the fleet was still months away, the entire strategic purpose of their mission had evaporated, yet they were ordered to continue. Discipline deteriorated. Officers and crew clashed. Some sailors talked openly of mutiny. Others drank heavily. Many simply fell into depression. The Madagascar delay. The fleet reached Madagascar in January 1905 and stayed there for 2 months, waiting for reinforcements and new orders. Madagascar became a purgatory, anchored in tropical heat, uncertain of their mission, watching comrades fall ill, nothing to do but wait and contemplate the disaster ahead. Admiral Rozhestvensky became increasingly irascible and abusive, lashing out at subordinates. He knew the mission was doomed, but was too committed or too proud to turn back. The final approach. Finally, in March 1905, the fleet departed Madagascar and began the final leg toward the Pacific. They sailed across the Indian Ocean past Singapore and approached Japan. By now, everyone knew the situation was hopeless. Port Arthur had fallen months ago. The Russian Pacific Fleet had been destroyed. The Japanese Navy, commanded by Admiral Togo Heiichiro, controlled the seas. Russian sailors were exhausted, demoralized, and poorly trained. The ships were in terrible condition after 7 months at sea. The Japanese knew exactly where the Russians were and were prepared. Rozhestvensky had 3 options for reaching Vladivostok: Russia's remaining Pacific port, the Tsugaru Strait between Honshu and Hokkaido, most direct but narrow and easily defended, the La Perouse Strait between Hokkaido and Sakhalin, longer but slightly more open, the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. Risky, but the shortest route. He chose Tsushima, gambling that surprise might let them slip through before the Japanese could concentrate their forces. It was a gamble he lost before he even made it. The Battle of Tsushima, Day 1. On May 27, 1905, the Russian fleet entered the Tsushima Strait. Admiral Togo and the Japanese combined fleet were waiting. The Japanese had every advantage. They were fighting in home waters. Their crews were experienced and well-trained. Their ships were faster and better maintained. They had modern fire control systems. They knew the Russian fleet's condition and morale. At approximately 1:39 p.m., the Japanese fleet was sighted. At 2:02 p.m., Togo executed one of naval history's most famous maneuvers. He ordered his fleet to turn in succession in front of the Russian line, a maneuver called crossing the T. This meant Japanese ships would cross perpendicular to the Russian line, allowing all Japanese guns to fire at the lead Russian ships, while those Russian ships could only fire their forward guns in response. It was a risky maneuver. During the turn, Japanese ships were vulnerable, but Togo understood that Russian gunnery was poor and the payoff was worth the risk. He was right. As Japanese ships completed the turn and crossed the Russian line, they opened fire with devastating accuracy. Russian gunnery, by contrast, was terrible. Shells fell short, flew wide, or missed entirely. The months of exhaustion, the poor training, the terrible conditions, it all showed. The Japanese used a new type of shell, the Shimo's shell, packed with a more powerful explosive that could penetrate armor and cause massive internal damage. Russian ships began exploding and burning. The Russian flagship Knyaz Suvorov, carrying Admiral Rozhestvensky, was hit repeatedly and set ablaze. By 7 p.m., the ship was a burning wreck, unable to steer or fight effectively. Rozhestvensky was wounded and had to transfer command. As darkness fell on May 27th, the Russian fleet was in chaos. Several ships had been sunk or crippled. Formations had disintegrated. Communications were nearly impossible, and the battle wasn't over. Night attack and Day 2. During the night of May 27th to 28th, Japanese torpedo boats launched waves of attacks on the disorganized Russian ships. In darkness and confusion, Russian vessels fired at shadows, sometimes hitting each other. Japanese torpedoes found their marks again and again. By dawn on May 28th, the Russian fleet was shattered. Individual ships or small groups were scattered across the strait, fleeing north toward Vladivostok. The Japanese hunted them down methodically. Some Russian ships surrendered, others were sunk. A few made suicidal charges at Japanese vessels and were destroyed. The battleship Borodino exploded and sank in under a minute, taking nearly 900 men down with her. By the end of May 28th, the Battle of Tsushima was over. The butcher's bill. The numbers are almost unbelievable. Russian losses: 21 ships sunk, including 6 battleships, 7 ships captured, including 2 battleships, 6 ships interned in neutral ports. Only 3 ships reached Vladivostok, approximately 5,000 sailors killed, 6,000 captured. Admiral Rozhestvensky captured wounded, Japanese losses. 3 torpedo boats sunk, 117 sailors killed, a few hundred wounded. It was the most one-sided ass-kicking in modern naval warfare. The Japanese had achieved what military historians call decisive battle, the complete destruction of an enemy fleet. The aftermath: revolution and history. The impact of Tsushima was immediate and profound. The end of the war. The Battle of Tsushima effectively ended the Russo-Japanese War. Russia could not replace the Baltic Fleet. Japan had established complete naval dominance. Peace negotiations began almost immediately, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. The Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, recognized Japan's victory. The First Russian Revolution, news of Tsushima arrived in Russia like a bomb. The regime had suffered catastrophic defeats on land, and now the fleet, sent with such fanfare, tracked with such hope, had been annihilated. Public anger erupted. The revolution of 1905 began just days after Tsushima with strikes, protests, and the famous Potemkin Mutiny. While the revolution was eventually suppressed, it foreshadowed the 1917 revolution that would destroy the Romanov dynasty. Japan's rise. Tsushima announced Japan as a major world power, the first non-European nation to defeat a European power in modern warfare. The psychological impact across Asia was enormous. Colonial subjects saw that European empires were not invincible. Naval doctrine: Tsushima influenced naval thinking for decades. The decisive fleet engagement became the ideal every navy sought. The battle demonstrated the importance of fire control, training, and morale. It validated the battleship as the dominant naval weapon, though submarines and aircraft would eventually challenge this. Russian humiliation. For Russia, Tsushima was a national humiliation. A European empire had been defeated by an Asian power. The best solution, sending the Baltic Fleet, had resulted in the worst naval disaster in Russian history. The survivors of the approximately 12,000 sailors who departed the Baltic in October 1904, only a fraction returned home. Those who survived the battle and made it to Vladivostok or were captured by Japan eventually returned to a Russia transformed by revolution and defeat. Admiral Rozhestvensky survived his wounds and was repatriated. He faced a court-martial, but was largely exonerated. Everyone knew he had been sent on an impossible mission. He lived quietly until his death in 1909, bitter and broken by the experience. Admiral Togo became a national hero in Japan, celebrated as one of history's great naval commanders. He lived until 1934, long enough to see the naval power he had helped build become a major force in the Pacific. The few ships that reached Vladivostok were eventually scrapped or captured in later conflicts. The wreckage of those sunk at Tsushima still lies on the sea floor of the strait. Lessons from disaster. The voyage of the 2nd Pacific Squadron and the Battle of Tsushima stand as monuments to the consequences of strategic delusion, institutional incompetence, and the refusal to accept reality, the sunk cost fallacy. Once the fleet was underway, Russia kept committing to the mission even after Port Arthur fell and the strategic purpose evaporated. They couldn't admit the voyage was pointless. Wishful thinking, Russian leadership convinced themselves that European superiority and numerical strength would overcome Japanese skill and preparation. Reality thought otherwise. Logistics matter. All the battleships in the world are useless if you can't get them where they're needed in fighting condition. The Russians learned this the hardest way possible. Morale wins battles. Technical factors matter, but a Japanese Navy's high morale and confidence versus the Russian fleet's exhaustion and defeatism may have been the decisive factor. Bad plans don't improve. The plan was flawed from the beginning. 7 months of suffering didn't make it better. Sometimes the brave decision is to abandon a doomed enterprise, not see it through to catastrophic conclusion. Conclusion: the battle that ended an era. On May 27th to 28th, 1905, in the waters of the Tsushima Strait, the Russian Baltic Fleet got its ass thoroughly kicked after sailing 18,000 miles over 7 months. It was a disaster foretold, predicted, and inevitable. Yet it happened anyway because pride, bureaucracy, and strategic delusion overrode common sense. The Battle of Tsushima didn't just sink ships. It sank Russian prestige, contributed to revolution, and announced that the age of European dominance was ending. An Asian power had defeated a European empire decisively, and the world would never be quite the same. And it all happened because Russia sent a fleet halfway around the world to fight a battle everyone knew it would lose, and then lost it even more catastrophically than anyone imagined possible. Sometimes the worst defeats aren't from enemy brilliance. Sometimes they're from your own side's spectacular refusal to accept reality until reality forces itself upon you in the most brutal way imaginable. The Russian sailors who sailed to Tsushima deserved better. They deserved competent leadership, realistic strategy, and a courage from their commanders to say, "This mission is impossible," before 5,000 men died proving it. Instead, they got 7 months of suffering and 2 days of slaughter. A voyage of the damned that ended exactly as everyone feared it would.